For you conspiracy fans out there, needless to say that the Holy Bible is full of possible contradictions and scenarios that are less than noble. I remember reading the Bible and hearing the list of noble humans God would prominently list off, indicating such things like they were the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that we find in Matthew 22:32, only to say to myself, what about Noah? Leading me to Genesis 9:23, where we find this winemaker, Noah, passed out drunk, completely naked, leading to much speculation as to the events of that night. Many stories of especially the Old Testament Bible are full of contradictions with the loving and merciful God that we eventually see in the New Testament Bible that leads to some interesting conspiracies. Depending on which religion you favor, the Urantia Book is the ultimate plausible spin on many of the old stories that were retold and distorted over thousands of years of oral traditions. Take the story of Adam and Eve. If we take the original account of the story, we find that Eve was seduced by a snake to eat forbidden fruit that was also consumed by Adam, that made both of them get cast out of the Garden of Eden for such an offense, and cursing them to toil the earth off the sweat of their brows, making both individuals mortal, and then henceforth having women associate the pain or exacerbated pain of childbirth? In the Urantia Book, we find ourselves with a special tree that had absolutely nothing to do with the default of Adam and Eve. A serpent in the form of our planetary prince Caligastia, who made Eve an offer that she could not refuse, along with the Urantia Book's explanation as to the consequences of Eve choosing to cheat God's plan and Adam's reluctant desire to go along with it due to their very fear of losing their beloved. There was most certainly a sinister plot in this timeless story, along with conspirators that were involved, that shed a great deal of light as to the Urantia's description of the events of the default of Adam and Eve. All right, well, let's get started. Introduction. In the Urantia Book, the Legend of Creation recounts the origin of the world and human beings on Urantia, also known as Earth. It presents an alternative perspective to the traditional biblical creation narratives, blending factual spiritual history with the myths and interpretations formed by early human civilizations, surrounding many of the world's religions. Adam and Eve were never the first created beings and were material sons that were brought to us as part of the spiritual administration of God and volunteered for the honor of uplifting our human ancestors. The legend of creation, as described in the Urantia Book, is influenced by historical events, such as the arrival of Adam and Eve on Urantia, and later cultural adaptations of these events into, of course, myths. The familiar story of the creation of the world in 6 days, as presented in many religions of the world, has roots in the teachings surrounding Adam and Eve's time in the Garden of Eden. According to the Urantia Book, this concept of 6 days was not part of the original creation, but was based on the 6 days Adam and Eve spent surveying the garden before making their initial plans. This structure of 6 days became sacred because of its association with the Adamic visit, but the belief in the literal 6-day creation arose later, over 30,000 years after these events. This later interpretation, which included the sudden appearance of the sun and moon, likely drew from the ancient traditions of the Earth's emergence from a dense space cloud, an event that had once obscured the visibility of these celestial bodies. The well-known story of Eve being created from Adam's rib is described in the Urantia Book as a symbolic misinterpretation of the arrival of Adam and Eve, and the celestial operations related to the fusion of life that occurred over 450,000 years ago. The Adamic arrival on Urantia involved complex spiritual and biological events that were misunderstood by subsequent generations. The account of Eve's creation from Adam's rib is a distortion of the actual celestial processes associated with the introduction of the Adamic race. Dalmatian influence. The Urantia Book explains that many of the early human civilizations, particularly in the Eastern Hemisphere, adopted the idea of human beings being created by clay. Random fact, did you know that when Jesus was growing up, that Christ Michael's obsession with molding people and figures out of clay upset his father Joseph due to violating their religious traditions? And Joseph actually demanded that his son Jesus stop the practice. Kind of makes sense when our Christ Michael is our creator in some ways. They'd want to do something like that when he was a kid. But anyways, this clay creation belief has roots in the ancient Dalmatian traditions, particularly associated with the early teachings of the planetary prince and his corporeal staff, who lived on Urantia over 450,000 years ago. The idea of humans being created from clay was common among ancient peoples, including those of the Middle East, Africa, and the Philippines, reflecting the widespread influence of the early Melchizedek and Adamite teachings on the development of human thought. While many early traditions held that humanity had been created through divine intervention or special creation, some cultures, such as certain groups among the Greeks, recognized the concept of evolution, seeing human beings as gradually emerging from lower life forms. In contrast to the later, more popular creation myths, the Urantia Book acknowledges the truth of evolution and progressive creation. This understanding was present in some ancient cultures, though often overshadowed by the belief in a sudden creation or special origins. For those of you that have not watched my previous videos, our planet Urantia is a decimal planet, being 1 out of 10 where life begins truly anew, and is considered an experimental world. As the story of Adam and Eve spread across the world, it was enriched and adapted by the Babylonians, who had contact with the remnants of the Adamic civilization. The Babylonians introduced a version of the creation story that portrayed humanity as descending directly from the gods, a narrative that emphasized an aristocratic and divine origin of the human race. This version of the creation myth was incompatible with earlier notions of humanity's gradual development or its creation from clay. Hebrew traditions. The Urantia Book suggests that the Old Testament account of creation, which became a fundamental narrative for Judaism and Christianity, was not directly taught by Moses, but was later a compilation of various traditions. Moses himself presented a simple narrative of creation, focusing on the worship of the Universal Father, the Creator of all. That in and of itself, attempting to transition a polytheistic pagan group into a single monotheistic driven society was quite the bridge indeed, with Moses choosing to carry over many of their traditions of animal sacrifices and burnt offerings to appease these traditions. Over time, this story became intertwined with the Adamic traditions, and by the time of the Babylonian exile, which was around 500 BC, the Hebrews had adopted a modified version of the Mesopotamian creation myth, including the six-day creation. The belief in Adam as the first man and the story of the creation in 6 days was crystallized in Jewish tradition. However, the Hebrews were unaware of the long history of civilization that preceded Adam's arrival on Urantia. Andon and Phanta were half-siblings that were our first ancestors to be infused with a fractal of God known as the thought adjuster simply because they were God-knowing, which signaled our planetary prince's soon arrival and, upon further met conditions, the eventual arrival of Adam and Eve. The traditions of creation became more formalized with the Hebrew return to Jerusalem, where the story was documented and ultimately translated into Greek, becoming part of the sacred scriptures. The Golden Age. The Urantia Book critiques the notion of a golden age, or utopian state, which many traditions, including Christianity, held to be the original perfect state of humanity. This myth of a lost, ideal state in the past often served as an explanation for humanity's perceived decline. In contrast, the Urantia Book teaches that humanity's progress is gradual, and it's an evolutionary process rather than one in which one falls from a once perfect state. This is a constant theme in the Urantia text surrounding seeking perfection from a fallible and perfect state, of which our whole universe is organized and administered to assist in this mortal ascension. Fun fact, did you know that our creator's son Michael came to our planet to descend from perfection, to know and understand their creations, and to submit to the very thought adjuster that we have? Eden, the garden where Adam and Eve first lived, was a real place with advanced spiritual teachings, but it was not perfect, nor was it an untouched paradise. Adam and Eve's tenure in the garden was marked by challenges and mistakes, leading to a tragic fall from their ideal state. Their failure to follow the divine plan led to a delay in the planetary development of Urantia, a situation that would only begin to recover through further spiritual revelations and leadership. It should be indicated that part of this default led to a partial universe quarantine of our planet as to not affect the other local creations that were following the same original divine plan. After the Hebrew creation myth was compiled and translated, it became part of the larger theological systems of Judaism, Christianity, and later, of course, Western thought. This narrative of creation, including the belief and the sudden and miraculous creation of humanity, influenced the philosophy and worldview of many Occidental peoples, shaping their understanding of the universe and humanity's place in it. However, the Urantia Book explains these religious doctrines also introduced the idea of a vengeful deity who punished humanity for the errors of their ancestors, fostering a view of human history as a decline from the original state of perfection. The default. It is expressed in the Urantia Book that our gender sometimes grants us certain predispositions. I always tell my clients that I have a chess-like mind, thinking or plotting about the future with aspirations of excitement and adventure. The Urantia Book indicates that often women are inclined to be the moral standards of the household, and they are most certainly one of the hardest mule workers of the family, and are frequently caught up in the present moment. Due to each gender's typical preference, both male and female attract one another due to offering what the other is currently missing. When it came to Caligastia indirectly tempting Eve, it must be stated that the plan of God was both slow and extremely arduous. As an example, early procreations of Adam's son and various other children of the pair, mating with humans already on the planet to uplift the species, were not very intelligent, and the evolution was seen by the pair as arduously slow and difficult. Caligastia, knowing this, purposely tempted Eve to expedite the process of laying with a corporeal staff member descendant of which he knew Eve fancied, having Serapatachia, who was one of Adam's most capable lieutenants, tempt her with a long-standing and attractive proposition. It should be noted that this first lieutenant was an honest and very capable individual, wanting to truly assist in our development and not realizing the consequences of his actions or that he was being manipulated through Caligastia. The lieutenant contended that if the Nodites, as the most progressive and cooperative race, could have a leader born to them of part origin in the violet stock, which of course was Adam and Eve, it would constitute a powerful tie binding these peoples more closely to the garden. And all of this was soberly and honestly considered to be for the greater good of the world, since this child, to be reared and educated in the garden, would exert a great deal of influence for good over his father's people. The plan was developed over the course of 5 years, and Eve chose Caligastia's corporeal staff member descendant, Caino, who had a superior physique and intellect compared to the neighboring races. Adam consented to the plan out of sheer fear of losing Eve and wanting to make her happy, although he knew better than Eve of the disastrous potential effects this could have. After the default transpired and Cain was born, the pair, Adam and Eve, immediately knew of their transgression, became mortal, and left the garden on their own free will due to the shame of their associated default. The voice in the garden searching for the pair was the seraphim associated with the Eden Project. However, the good news is that the duo has been forgiven by Christ Michael, and Adam actually sits on a panel of judges representing a true ascendant perspective on human error and atonement. So not all was lost due to the default, and Adam most certainly gained some much needed perspective when it comes to human decision-making. Conclusion. In summary, the Urantia Book offers a unique interpretation of the creation of Urantia and humanity, explaining how early spiritual events were interpreted and mythologized by later generations. While the book acknowledges the influence of the Adamic teachings in the gradual development of human spirituality, it also highlights the evolutionary nature of creation, contrasting it with the more static and retrogressive views that became entrenched in many religions of old. The Adam and Eve conspiracy was years in the making and involved many prestigious individuals. However, much like is the human tradition, the pair were unwilling to see the benefits associated with hard work and even suffering and chose the easier road, which went against the divine plan of God. However, unlike the biblical account of a wrathful God that smites those who defy them, we meet progenitors such as Christ Michael and even God who wishes to understand and forgive us. If only we were able to understand and forgive each other.